Pause for a moment. Before your thoughts take over, allow yourself to simply breathe and be present. What you are about to hear didn't just land in your life randomly. There has been something inside you that's been quietly carrying weight for a long time. You've had to stay strong without receiving the clarity you deserved, and even now, there is still one name that seems to surface when everything around you gets quiet. You might tell yourself you've moved on or that it doesn't affect you anymore, but deep down, something in you recognizes the truth. And tonight, that truth is not here to harm you. It is not here to reopen wounds for no reason. It is here to bring understanding where confusion has lived for too long. This message is meant to reach the part of you that has been waiting for answers, even when you tried to ignore that waiting. Your person was once involved with someone else. That is a reality that cannot be softened or rewritten. But what follows goes far beyond surface explanations like distance, silence, or what looked like betrayal. There is something deeper unfolding beneath all of that. A message is now rising from their emotional world toward you, something they were unable to express when it actually mattered. Take another slow breath. Let it settle. You didn't arrive here by coincidence. Something subtle has been guiding you toward this moment, even if you couldn't explain it logically. Maybe their presence has been lingering in your thoughts more often than you expected. Maybe certain memories keep resurfacing without warning, or perhaps you've been moving through an emotional state that feels like a mix of longing, uncertainty, and quiet sadness that you can't fully put into words. This is not here to pressure you into believing anything. It is not meant to overwhelm you or push you toward assumptions. Instead, it is speaking directly to the part of you that has been searching for clarity where none was given. Yes, it is true that your person was involved with someone else. That fact exists and cannot be erased. But what you are beginning to understand now goes much deeper than that single layer of their life or the choices they made on the surface. There is something emerging now from their inner world, a message they held back, a truth they avoided, something their heart never fully managed to express while they had the chance. And underneath it all, there was something you always sensed, even if you never had confirmation. You always noticed it, even when nothing was directly said. Your intuition picked up signals long before your mind could make sense of them. There was always a feeling that something wasn't fully aligned. Even when they smiled and acted composed, even when they insisted everything was fine or tried to convince you that their decisions were final, something inside you resisted fully believing it. You felt it in the silence that followed certain conversations. You felt it in the way messages sometimes ended too abruptly, leaving more unsaid than spoken. You felt it in the invisible distance that appeared without any clear explanation. It was never just imagination. It was perception, your emotional awareness noticing what was never openly acknowledged. And even though you tried to override it, to rationalize it, or to accept what you were being shown on the surface, that inner knowing never completely disappeared. They didn't leave because their feelings disappeared. They left because they were overwhelmed by emotions they didn't have the tools to process. When they entered a connection with someone else, it was never truly about replacing you. It was more about escape, an attempt to step away from the intensity of what they felt and convince themselves they could find emotional silence somewhere else. But the truth they are slowly beginning to recognize is this: you were never replaced in their heart. You were simply set aside. And that decision has created consequences they are still quietly dealing with. Part 2. Why they chose someone else. This part may not be easy to take in, but it holds something important for your inner clarity and healing. Their choice was not rooted in love for someone else. It was rooted in fear. Fear of emotional depth, fear of being fully seen, fear of the vulnerability that came with what you represented to them. What they experienced with you was never casual or surface level. It carried weight. It stirred something real in them. But instead of staying present with that intensity, they chose what felt simpler in the moment, something that required less emotional exposure, less inner confrontation, and less accountability. That other connection may have appeared easier because it didn't demand the same depth from them. It didn't challenge their emotional boundaries the way you did. It allowed them to breathe without immediately facing themselves. Yet even after they moved forward, something in them never fully let go of you. In subtle ways, they kept you alive in their mind. They compared moments without realizing it, different conversations, different laughter, even the way silence felt with someone else versus how it felt with you. And without consciously meaning to, every comparison brought them back to the same realization. What they had with you was not easily replicable. Over time, that truth became harder to ignore. They began to understand, too late, that the connection they stepped away from wasn't something that could simply be recreated with different circumstances or a different person. Part 3. The silence they carry. From the outside, it may seem like they moved on cleanly, as if everything was left behind without consequence. But internally, that is not the full picture. There are moments, especially late at night, when their thoughts become heavier than they let anyone see. In that quiet space, reflection becomes unavoidable, and with it comes guilt. Guilt for leaving without offering real explanation. Guilt for the emotional confusion left behind. Guilt for the way things ended without closure, as if important words were never spoken. And in that silence, memories don't fade, they surface, not loudly, but persistently. Not to punish them, but to confront them with what they avoided facing in the moment. Because even in distance, emotional truth doesn't fully disappear. They replay moments in their mind more often than they admit. Old conversations resurface in unexpected ways, sometimes triggered by the smallest things, a place they once saw with you, a random phrase someone else uses, or even a silence that feels too familiar. And now, certain things you once said carry a completely different weight, because with time, they finally understand what you meant. What once sounded simple now feels layered. What once felt like something they could brush off now feels like something they should have paid closer attention to. They recognize you didn't deserve the confusion you were left with. You didn't deserve the silence that followed moments of closeness. You didn't deserve the mixed signals that kept you guessing. And you definitely didn't deserve the emotional uncertainty that came after their decisions. Decisions you were never fully included in but still deeply affected by. But this realization doesn't arrive in a clean or organized way. It doesn't come as a single moment of clarity. Instead, it appears in fragments, late-night thoughts, sudden memories, brief emotional discomfort they can't fully explain. Pieces that don't initially look connected, but slowly form a pattern they can no longer ignore. And yet, this guilt is not something that announces itself loudly. It doesn't show up in obvious emotional breakdowns or direct confessions. Instead, it lingers quietly in the background of their life, hidden behind distractions, routines, responsibilities, and forced composure. They continue functioning, continue talking, continue moving forward. But underneath all of that, something remains unresolved, a quiet echo that never fully disappears. Because avoiding feelings never removed them, it only delayed them, and in many cases, it deepened them. The more they tried to suppress it, the more indirect it became. It stopped being a feeling they could name and started becoming a pattern in their thoughts, a recurring discomfort they couldn't fully locate or explain. Part 4. Why they couldn't speak, before you might still wonder why they never expressed any of this when it mattered most. If all of this emotional depth was already present inside them, why didn't it come out in the moment? Why did it only become visible in hindsight? The truth is, it was never because they felt nothing. It was because they were overwhelmed by everything they were feeling at once and didn't have the internal structure to hold it properly. There was fear in them, but not a simple kind of fear. It wasn't fear of you, and it wasn't fear of the connection itself. It was fear of what would happen if they allowed themselves to fully step into it. Afraid that if they opened their mouth, everything they had been holding back would come out uncontrollably. Afraid that honesty would create commitments they weren't emotionally prepared to maintain. Afraid that vulnerability would expose parts of them they had spent years trying to keep controlled. And deeper than that, there was fear of responsibility. Because once something is spoken clearly, it cannot be unseen. Once feelings are named, they require action. And action requires consistency, accountability, and emotional presence, all things they were unsure they could sustain at that time. They were also afraid that once truth entered the space between you, it would permanently change the dynamic, that there would be no way to return to the comfort of distance or ambiguity once clarity existed. And there was another layer, one they rarely admit even to themselves. They were afraid of you. Not in a negative or threatening sense, but in the way you reflected emotional truth too clearly. You had a way of noticing shifts in energy, of feeling when something wasn't being said. You could read between the lines without needing explanations. And that made them feel exposed, because you weren't someone they could easily mislead, not intentionally, but emotionally. You sensed too much, and they knew that if they were fully honest with you, there would be no easy way to remain half in and half out of the connection. No comfortable distance to retreat into. So they stayed silent. But silence is never neutral. It doesn't preserve anything, it slowly transforms everything. And over time, what isn't spoken doesn't disappear. It accumulates. Part 5. What changed inside them? Something within them has shifted, even if nothing externally dramatic appears to have changed. There was a period where they felt emotionally drained, disconnected from themselves, distant from others, and strangely hollow in places they didn't have language for. Life continued as normal on the surface, but internally something felt out of alignment, as if they were moving through experiences without fully being present in them. And in that emptiness, something unexpected happened. Your presence began to return, not as a fading memory they occasionally recalled, but as something more stable, more persistent, more emotionally anchored in their inner world. At first, it was subtle. A passing thought, a moment of recognition, a feeling that surfaced without warning and disappeared just as quickly. But over time, it became harder to dismiss, because they started noticing a pattern. Certain emotional gaps in their life seemed to echo your absence. Certain moments of reflection kept circling back to you, not in a nostalgic way, but in a way that felt unresolved. And slowly, something began to shift in how they understood the connection. They began to realize that what they once labeled as confusion was never truly confusion at all. It was depth they didn't know how to navigate, emotional intensity they weren't prepared to hold. A level of connection that required presence they didn't yet have, and real connection doesn't disappear simply because it is avoided. It doesn't dissolve just because it is not acknowledged. It lingers, it integrates, it leaves imprints in places that surface later when the mind becomes quieter and the distractions no longer fill every gap. And in those quieter moments, what they feel becomes harder to reinterpret as something insignificant. Part 6. The message they wish they could say if they could speak without fear, without internal conflict, without the weight of their own hesitation interfering. This is what would eventually come through them. I thought choosing something easier would bring me peace. I thought distance would help me feel more in control of myself, more stable, more certain. But I see now that I misunderstood what I was running from. Walking away from you didn't bring clarity. It didn't bring relief. It created a kind of emotional absence I didn't know how to name at the time. And over time, I started realizing that what I called space was actually loss. I know I hurt you. I know my silence left you with questions I never answered and emotions you were left to carry alone. I didn't have the capacity to show up the way I should have, and I understand now that absence still has impact, even when it is unintentional. But I need you to understand something I couldn't express before. It was never about you not being enough. It was about me not being ready for how deeply you mattered. And that truth is something I am only now beginning to fully understand. These words may never reach you in reality. They may remain unspoken, contained within thought rather than action, but in their inner world they exist clearly, repeatedly, persistently, And over time, what remains unspoken does not fade. It becomes something they continue to carry, something that quietly shapes how they remember you, and something they can no longer fully unfeel. You are no longer in the same emotional place you were before. You're not waiting in confusion anymore. You're not questioning your value the way you once did. You're not sitting in silence trying to decode mixed signals or searching for meaning in inconsistency. Something in you has shifted, quietly at first, then permanently, and that shift has changed the entire dynamic of this connection. Because once you stop orbiting uncertainty, the entire emotional structure between you and them begins to change. It doesn't collapse immediately. It doesn't disappear in a dramatic way. Instead, it recalibrates, slowly, subtly, invisibly at first, and that recalibration is what they begin to feel, not through words, not through confrontation, not through explanations, but through absence, clarity, and change. They can feel that you are choosing yourself now. They can sense that your attention is no longer leaking into spaces that don't return anything meaningful. They can sense that you are no longer emotionally available for uncertainty, for inconsistent effort, for silence that is never explained, and for connections that only function on confusion. And in that realization, something uncomfortable begins to surface for them, the awareness that time is no longer standing still. Because for a long time, they may have unconsciously assumed that the dynamic would remain suspended, that you would remain emotionally accessible in the same way, that your presence would still be available even without consistent care or clarity. But that version of the dynamic no longer exists. Something has changed, and they are starting to notice it in the only way they can, through distance they didn't expect to feel so sharply. Part 8. The shock you didn't expect. What they are experiencing now goes beyond simple regret. Regret is too small a word for what begins to unfold inside them when they realize the weight of what was left unspoken, unresolved, and unfinished. Because they are not only thinking about you, they are also beginning to question themselves, the version of themselves that made those choices, the version of themselves that stayed silent, the version of themselves that avoided honesty when it mattered most, the version of themselves that convinced them it was easier to step away than to stay present. And that confrontation is not gentle. It doesn't arrive as a single realization. It comes in waves, in reflections, in moments where their present self collides with their past behavior, and the gap between the two becomes impossible to ignore. Because losing you didn't just create distance between two people, it created distance within them as well. And that internal distance is far more difficult to navigate. There is a quiet discomfort that comes from realizing you cannot undo emotional impact simply by understanding it later. You cannot reverse silence once it has already been heard. You cannot erase confusion once it has already shaped someone's experience. So they don't just miss you in a simple sense, they also begin to feel confronted by the emotional version of themselves that existed when they let you go. And that version of them is not easy to reconcile with, because it raises questions they cannot answer quickly. Why didn't I speak? Why didn't I stay present? Why did I assume distance was easier than honesty? Why did I think this would not matter later? And those questions do not come with relief. They come with weight. Part 9. What this means for you. This message is not here to pull you backward. It is not here to reopen emotional doors that you already walked away from. It is not here to create hope where clarity is needed. It is not here to suggest that you should wait, anticipate, or remain emotionally tied to something that was never consistently held. This is here for one reason only: clarity. You were never removed from someone's life because you lacked value. You were not discarded because you were too much, or not enough, or difficult to understand. You were stepped away from because you represented something they were not prepared to meet fully at the time: depth, emotional honesty, consistency, and presence. And those qualities can feel overwhelming to someone who has not yet learned how to hold them. But that has nothing to do with your worth, and everything to do with their capacity at that time, because readiness is not the same as compatibility, and timing is not the same as value. Regardless of whether this connection ever returns or not, one truth remains unchanged. You are not in the same emotional position you once were. You are not the same version of yourself that tolerated confusion in the name of potential. You are not the same version of yourself that overanalyzed silence hoping it would eventually turn into clarity. You are not the same version of yourself that confused inconsistency with depth. That version of you has already shifted, and that shift matters more than any unanswered question ever could. Because growth is not always loud. Sometimes it is simply the quiet moment where you stop asking the same questions about someone who keeps giving you no answers. And in that silence, something powerful forms: self-respect. So if this connection ever crosses your path again, you will not be approaching it from the same emotional place. You will not be responding from longing. You will not be reacting from confusion. You will not be trying to decode meaning from minimal effort. You will be responding from awareness, from clarity, from stability, from self-respect that no longer negotiates with uncertainty. And if it never returns, your life still continues forward without fragmentation. Because you were never meant to build emotional stability around inconsistency. You were meant to outgrow it. Before this ends, hold on to this. You were real in a space where emotions were avoided. You were honest in a space where honesty was difficult. You were present in a space where presence was inconsistent, and that combination leaves an imprint that time does not erase quickly. Not because you were chasing them, but because you were real enough to be remembered clearly. And that is something they cannot fully undo, even if they try to move forward. And finally, there is nothing left for you to chase here. No clarity to extract from silence. No meaning to force from inconsistency, no resolution to create alone, only understanding to carry forward. And with that understanding, something else quietly begins. The end of confusion, and the beginning of something steadier inside you. End of message.